Welcome, and thanks for listening to Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector podcast series. In each episode, we hear from the best in the business on the latest challenges, trends, and opportunities affecting the government and public sector. I'm Christian Fjellgraf, leader of Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector industry team. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for joining us.
Hello and welcome to Navigating the Freeze, insights from a certified grants management specialist and a policy expert. I am your grants management specialist, Kat Kizior, and I'm the grants management solutions lead for Cherry Bekaert. I have 25 or so years in grants and accounting across various types of organizations, state and local government, not-for-profit, and for-profit entities. I am a certified grants management specialist, which is a CGMS, and I'm active with National Grants Management Association. And I am super excited today to be recording with one of my absolute favorite partners in podcasting, Robert Shea.
Kat, I'm so intimidated by that introduction.
Please.
I'm delighted to be with you again. My name's Robert Shea. I have had a career in government, first in the House and Senate Oversight Committees, and then in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. Also spent a considerable amount of time consulting at Grant Thornton. And I couldn't be happier to be joining my friends at Cherry Bekaert to talk about the whirlwind we've been in the last 10 days.
Right. And I'm pretty sure I'm the one that should be intimidated, but thank you very much. And I am, again, super happy to be working together again. And by the way, Robert, just to kick this off, I want to tell you what the real title of this podcast is. It's called The Federal Funding Freeze Frenzy. Yeah. So say that 10 times fast. For some reason, they didn't want me to use that title. It just didn't fly. I don't know why, but instead we went with the title.
Don't let a bunch of accountants tell you what to title your podcast.
So unofficially, the federal funding freeze frenzy. I'm afraid I'm really going to mess that up at some point. Anyway, speaking of flies, we are doing this podcast on the fly pretty much to bring you the latest on the funding freeze that happened this fourth week of January. We want to talk about how these policy changes could affect funding now and in the future, and discuss what actions an organization can take to lessen the effects of these current and potential federal funding policy changes. So let's talk about the chaos. I don't call it chaos, use whatever word you like. That was how it was in the grants management world that ensued this past Monday night, or for me, Tuesday night when I woke up at 7 a.m. to a text that said, you got to read this, get up, and my day started that way. So some of us woke up to the news that there was going to be a freeze or a halt on federal financial assistance that would take effect at 5 p.m. that evening. First came the executive order that was dated January 27th, 2025, from the Executive Office of the President, the OMB office, which is the Office of Management and Budget. They put out a memorandum called the M-25-13 with the subject, temporary pause of agency grant, loan, and other financial assistance programs. It then went on to say, this memorandum requires federal agencies to identify and review all federal financial assistance programs and supporting activities consistent with the President's policies and requirements. And federal agencies must temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance and other relevant agency activities implicated by executive orders. So right there, that's automatic panic, especially in the grants world. So after a few hours later, a clarifying memo was released by OMB, specifically stating the executive order subject to the pause and clarifying that all financial assistance was not subject to the freeze, that student loans, SNAP, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security disbursements would definitely not be affected, and it was not an impoundment under the Impoundment Control Act. Now, maybe, Robert, I don't know if you know about the Impoundment Control Act, but maybe if you do, we get to termination, you can kind of tell us what that is and walk us through it. Anyway, by the end of the day, there was a lawsuit filed, and by the next morning, that OMB memo, M-25-13, was rescinded. Whew, that was a lot. So, Robert, this left all of our heads spinning, no doubt yours as well, and everyone up there who deals with policy. I know a lot about federal assistance compliance, but I do not know the ins and outs of federal policy. Can you please give us your take on why this is happening? Is it all about presidential initiatives? Are there other aspects that might be involved here?
Yes, 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 and yes. So I think our heads are spinning with the rash of actions that the Trump administration has taken since the president was inaugurated on January 20th. I've tried to track things very closely, but they're making it really hard. And this is just one of the examples. So you're right. The memo was issued, very broad freeze on payments for loans and grants. They tried to walk that back with subsequent guidance, limiting it. But the damage was done, and agencies were so confused that payment systems were shut down, including Medicaid.
Right.
So based on that blowback, the memo was rescinded. Now, what you didn't say, Kat, was the White House press secretary said that it wasn't rescinded and that the payment freeze remained. And a judge, based on that, retained the injunction on the freeze in spending. Now, what's the genesis of all this? There are a lot of threads. A number of executive orders may have driven this. One prevented all future spending on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And that executive order and subsequent memorandum required agencies to inventory individuals, contracts, or grantees related to DEIA be sent to OMB. Another executive order halted the climate-related spending under the Inflation Reduction Act. And so likewise, programs that were spending in those areas had to be reported to OMB, and that's ongoing. So another thread here is that officials in the incoming administration have said that they think the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I don't know how nerdy you want to get, but the Impoundment Control Act was enacted after the Watergate scandals of the 1970s to bring greater congressional control over the executive branch. And this basically says what Congress appropriates, the administration has to spend. They don't have discretion, or they have limited discretion on how and when to spend those funds. Because the incoming administration has asserted that law to be unconstitutional, they're going to try and test that. But they want to test it in the right place, which is why the language you pointed out, saying this was not an impoundment under the Impoundment and Control Act, this was a simple pause of appropriations, is really important. Right. But, I think the administration's view is that spending under the IRA that's climate related and spending on DEIA initiatives remains paused, not paused, really prevented. And we'll see what fights ensue after that, but that's where we are today. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I do want to ask you one more thing regarding the memo that originally came out. And I was just thinking about this as you were talking. So they did list a certain number of grant funding, folks that receive federal funding for certain purposes that they want to halt. One of those was funding to non-governmental entities. And that's the last thing that I saw or heard on that. Do you think that is still something that they're going to try to halt funding for, like our nonprofits and such?
So I think it remains to be seen. I think the administration and the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, has ambitious budget cutting targets. I don't want to pin them down, but somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion annually, which is a lot and impractical. But to the extent an entity, nonprofit, NGO, what have you, is engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility, or climate-related initiatives under the Inflation Reduction Act, I think those are going to be the target of an ongoing pause. But there will be in the short term budget cutting initiatives that are going to likewise impact spending. You've seen a major pause in foreign assistance spending. And so it's not clear where the axe will land, but so it's very important that this continue to be monitored if you are the recipient of federal funds in any form.
Definitely. Thank you for that clarity. Thank you. So would you say this is not over by a long shot?
I would say it is not over by a long shot. One of the interesting facets of this is the list of programs that the Office of Management and Budget has sent to agencies. They basically sent out a worksheet saying, we would like you to fill this out. And it's basically what's the name of the program, what component administers it, identify the senior political appointee who's going to govern it. Does the program have any pending funding? Does the program have any anticipated obligation or disbursement of funds before 3/15/2025, which is notably around the time the current continuing resolution expires? Does the program have any statutory requirements mandating the obligation of disbursements? So they want to make sure that there's not some other statute that requires the spending that would give them flexibility to stop it. Provide the date of the next obligation. Again, you mentioned this. Does the program provide federal funding to non-governmental organizations supporting or providing services either directly or indirectly to removable or illegal aliens? Is the program a foreign assistance program? Does the program provide funding that's implicated by the revocation and rescission of the U.S. International Climate Finance Plan? So I could go on. I don't want to bore you, but it gives you some idea of the kind of investigation they're doing so that they can target the pause going forward to those kinds of programs.
Okay. So as a grant nerd and a grants professional, one of the things that I've heard a lot of talk about is how federal funding terminations can come about. I mean, are there specific conditions that must be met? How much power does the executive branch actually hold in cases like these? And here's why I ask Robert. There are specific rules in the Uniform Guidance that dictate how and why the federal government can terminate funding. The majority of those cover termination for cause, right? For example, the October 1st Uniform Guidance clarifications to CFR 200 state that explicit language for termination must be in the terms and conditions of the funding agreement. Otherwise, the grant or funding cannot be terminated, except for some certain circumstances like HHS, they are in a different boat. So 2 CFR 200.340 says the federal award may be terminated in part or in its entirety as follows: by the federal agency or pass-through entity pursuant to the terms and conditions of the federal award, including to the extent authorized by law if an award no longer effectuates the program goals and agent priorities. So that's the first part. The second part, which is part B, is the federal agency or pass-through entity must clearly and unambiguously specify all termination provisions in the terms and conditions of the federal award. So if it wasn't explicitly stated in the terms and conditions, how is it that the executive office has the right to override this? From a policy standpoint, how is this possible? Could this actually happen? And how does this affect the rights of organizations when it comes to terminating federal funding?
So it is my understanding that the government has a broad ability to terminate grants and contracts for their convenience. There may be the ability to file a claim for compensation based on that termination. But this administration doesn't seem to be bound by traditional or even legal limitations on its spending, including termination of grants, contracts, and loans. So I expect a lot of these things to be tested in the courts. And as you and I have already discussed, people sued the administration based on the initial memorandum that paused spending. A judge enjoined that pause, but even after it was rescinded based on comments from the White House, the judge continued to institute the injunction. So I think this is going to be a big debate. We're going to find out where the line is in the next 6, 12, 18 months as lawsuits work their way through the courts. And I'm sorry I can't be more certain on that, but you've got an administration that wants to test the guardrails. And so we'll all find out together. We should schedule another podcast, Kat, for when that decision comes down.
We should. We definitely should. And you're right. There is no certainty anywhere, and so far in this administration with our grants, assistance funding, and what's going to happen next. All we can do is be as preemptive as possible. So it's interesting that you said this is going to be going to the courts and it's going to be a fight. So really the rights of the federal aid recipients and the communities that depend on this funding for helping our country's citizens they're really going to have to fight for those rights, it sounds like. So for example, here's a question. If the funding for, say, the new Green Deal is ramped down or terminated, how does this realign the country's focus? So if we're not spawning ingenuity with energy, are we navigating away from clean energy solutions altogether? What is your opinion as a policy expert with this shift? So I'm trying to kind of look at, will there still be some funding if this totally goes belly up and they're like, we don't want any green energy? I mean, is this a total package deal that is over, or how do you think as an expert this is going to work?
I wish I had a better crystal ball. I think funding for climate-related initiatives is going to decline significantly. And that means contracts, grants, loans across the board. I'll be interested to see what Congress appropriates, both in reconciliation, which we can talk about if you want, or FY 25, 26 spending. Now, what I've seen is that private foundations may pick up the slack. President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accords upon inauguration, but Michael Bloomberg stepped in and said he would replace that contribution himself. And someday you and I might have that much money, Kat, but I don't know how much money you have to step in for another country's, for the biggest economy in the world's investment in the Paris Accords. And maybe he won't do all of it, but I think you'll see private industry step in to replace investment in some of the innovation related to climate and other areas where the Trump administration has stepped back. But I think innovation across the board is going to be highly sought after. So you'll see the investment that was in DEIA or climate move to more innovative or conservative related fields.
Yeah, I think as Americans, or even if you're outside of America, listening to this podcast, we step up and we help each other when we have to, right?
Right.
Exactly. So I almost forgot to ask you about grant regulations. So I have heard that compliance and regulations will most likely be more stringent going forward. And most grant professionals, we can barely handle the workload we have now. Have you heard or read anything about this, about the possibility of these kind of restructuring and adding more regulations onto the federal funding going forward that hopefully they don't terminate?
Yeah. I've not heard anything specifically on this, but as you know, I've been working pretty hard to advertise the flexibility that's existing in the new uniform guidance.
Right.
And in trying to better articulate how state, local, tribal governments can take advantage of some of those flexibilities, we've highlighted some enormous inefficiencies and inadequacies in government oversight of grants. So the Program Support Center at the Department of Health and Human Services has an enormous backlog in approving statewide cost allocation plans.
Right.
I think there's an opportunity to really improve federal, state, local collaboration here. If funding is constrained, can't we all get together, talk about relaxing some of those restrictions, improve the ability to tap grant funding streams to invest in things like data systems or evaluation, and reduce the reporting? Because, the dirty little secret, maybe not so much secret to you people, is the reporting by grantees to a great extent goes unused. Audit findings are ignored, and in many cases, grant funds go unused because grantees can't muster the resources to meet reporting obligations. I mean, I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but that's my thinking on that question, Kat.
You're absolutely correct. I agree with you. That I agree with your perspective, and it would be anything we can do to reduce administrative burden and increase knowledge and grants compliance. I'm all for it. That's what we need.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I'm going to wrap up with some key activities that you as an organization should consider now and in the long term to help lessen the impact of a loss of federal funding. So here are some ideas for you and some actions you can take that may be helpful. First, review your current awards and see if anything is out of alignment. If any part of your grant funding is going to any of those areas we discussed that are under review, DEI, the new Green Deal, etc., stop that spending immediately and start looking for alternative funding sources. Secondly, look at your current expenses. Anything may become ineligible going forward. We talked about the total uncertainty of everything at this point. The budget is not in place yet, and any expense can become a red flag at any time. So make sure you look at those expenses and what you have. So next, to help combat those problems, have alternative funding strategies to cover your costs. You need to look at your draws and your expenses, and you have to have a plan for timing. You may have to tighten that timeline and do quicker reimbursements. After the federal budget is in place, we don't know we're going to have that funding anymore. So think about that as you go forward. Think about timing, reevaluate how you're going to cover costs and how and when your timelines work. And the one thing that I really like, read your terms and conditions, look for that explicit language. And I, have this in here. Now Robert's talking about, well, that may not even matter at this point, and we're going to have to fight. So hopefully that explicit language will stick, and you'll be able to keep that and use it to maintain your rights to your federal funding. Biggest thing, stay informed. Keep an eye on the news. Follow your favorite grants consultants and your favorite grants management consultant and your favorite policy experts on LinkedIn, because we post a lot on there and keep a lot of people updated, or any other media sources to follow on. And talk with your peers, talk with other grants management professionals. And please, if you get information, you see an update that comes out, put that information out there somewhere on media, share it with your peers, share it with other folks that are in the same situation you may be in with the federal funding. And please stay compliant. You still have to follow the rules. You have to turn in your reports on time. Hit those reporting deadlines. Don't give them any reason to terminate your funding in an area where they could easily look at it and say, you didn't do this. So stay compliant on all of your grants. Even if there's some that they're putting a halt to, make sure you do everything you're supposed to do. So let's really quick look at the possible long-term effects, long-term planning, and what I would call the waterfall effect. So the waterfall effect is when a benefit or an impact cascades down through an organization into your community, into your client base. So in this case, from your federal funding and down. Consider the impact of financial decisions that are going to cascade through your organization and affect your community and your client base. And so really examine your funding cycles. Just like I said, really look at that timing and prepare long-term for potential funding disruptions. Look at your cycle now and analyze your cycle, your funding cycles. Look at your timing. Look at when your incoming grants and funds come in. Identify when there might be uncertainty or you may have insufficient funding, and make sure you cover for that. And most of all, contingency planning. So make sure you have a backup plan to address any potential funding shortfalls that you're going to have. Have that plan in place, strategize. And so this should include maintaining operations and risk management and minimizing any kind of negative impacts that would be on your organization or your community or your clients. So key takeaways from your grants management expert, me, yours truly, is protect your organization, protect your communities and your stakeholders, and be prepared and plan accordingly, because we have no idea what the state of our federal funding is going to be tomorrow. So how about those key takeaways from our policy expert?
Well, I think monitor things closely. Whitehouse.gov has a pretty good tracking of official actions. Don't follow unofficial statements like from the White House press secretary, and stay very close to your grants management officials at the cognizant agency. It'll be critical for you to keep those lines of communication open and listen to Kat. I think the instructions you gave were incredibly thorough and will serve grantees well if they follow your advice.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for filling us in the areas on policy where everyone is wondering what's going to happen. So it's wonderful to have your views and your knowledge here to keep us updated, let us know what's going on. So we will provide you in our show notes the executive orders, the memorandums, and that spreadsheet that accompanied the memo, so you have access to all those docs. And thank you so much for listening today. And though we can't give you any assurances on what the next day will bring in the federal funding assistance world, we can help keep you up to date and informed. So Robert and I will be on top of these issues as they arise, and we will be back together soon. And I was going to say that's my plan. I was going to drag him along, but he already said that. So I think I've already dragged him in. So I think we're good for our next podcast. And we will definitely bring you any updates on what ensues over the course of the next few years, and more currently, even with that, with federal funding. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Robert's email is rshea@govnavigators.com. And my email is kat.kizior, Kizior, @cbh.com. Anything else you'd like to say, Robert, before we head out?
Delighted to be with you, and I look forward to doing this again. Never a dull moment.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, and we will see you next time.
This was Christian again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to our next one. Don't forget to subscribe.